What's going on, everyone? And welcome to another episode of Writing Friction. And as always, today's guest is pretty cool. Everyone say hello to Brian Evenson. How are you, Brian?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Not too bad, not too bad. We were both, before the podcast, we were both talking about we're both representing San Francisco.
Yeah.
I got to admit, I've been in SF. I moved here from New Jersey nine,
hmm
10 years ago.
Yeah.
I've never done the Alcatraz tour.
Oh, you haven't?
I've
My,
never done it.
my wife actually used to work as a volunteer gardener on Alcatraz.
No
And
way.
so
Okay.
we did both the Alcatraz tour, but also the behind the scenes tour. And we got to stay overnight there on my birthday. So I feel very warmly towards Alcatraz.
Do you sleep in the cells or how does
Uh-huh.
that really?
Yeah, yeah. So all the people who are working on the island, there's one night a year where they come over and they can sleep in the cells. And everyone has an idea of the cell they want to stay in. So like the most popular criminals, their cells are always quickly taken.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's pretty cool to be there kind of in the middle of the night, dead quiet. Yeah.
On a rock in the middle of the bay, and also in the middle of some of the coldest and most shark-infested water that I'm
Right.
aware of. Yeah. Did
Exactly.
you live in the Bay Area, or are you from
Uh,
where? Are you?
I didn't, but my wife was living up there when we kind of got together in
Uh,
2011. And
okay.
so I traveled there a lot. I kind of started to feel like it was a home away from home. And then she decided to move out to Rhode Island when we got married. And then we slowly made our way back to California. I'm in Southern California now.
Okay. Cool. So where are you from originally? How did you end up in SoCal? What's the journey?
I was born in Iowa. I grew up in Utah,
Mm-hmm.
and then I kind of have lived all over after that. I lived in Oklahoma, Wisconsin. I lived in Southern California for a little while. Rhode Island, as right before I was here. Denver, I lived in for about 4 years as well.
Did you write your first words in Iowa?
Uh, Probably not. I was like two by the time I moved from Iowa, so I
Okay.
probably
To
said my
Utah.
first words. Yeah.
Okay. So then what was the first thing you started writing? Did you start writing or you start reading? Can you comprehend the difference between the two at that time?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, I can remember like the first story that I wrote that I thought was a story, and it was about a rock that lived at the center of the earth and was feeling all this pressure. And I think I was probably 6 or 7 when I wrote that, something like that. So it's weird to look back at that stuff and realize that there were like certain things in my writing that have always been there.
Do you still
Um,
have copies of that stuff?
Somewhere I sold my literary archives to the Beinecke Library, which is at Yale, and so their copies there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, so you're living in Utah. What are you doing? I mean, are you writing as a young man? Are you going with the idea of you want to be a writer? Or is that pretty much what you set yourself out to do?
Well, pretty quickly. So my when I was growing up, my mom decided she wanted to be a science fiction writer,
Oh wow.
and so she had 5 kids. I was the oldest of 5 kids, and so to give herself time to like write, she would set all of us up kind of working on creative projects, and the younger kids would do art projects or finger paints or something like that. And when it finally came to me, I think I was 12 or 13 at the time, she just said, oh, you should just write too. And so that was kind of the start for me, just this idea of just doing this writing as a way of giving my mom some time. And I just really realized I liked it. I really enjoyed just the process of kind of making things from words, and then it kind of caught on after that.
Were you enjoying and were you writing science fiction as well?
I was reading a lot of science fiction. I was writing kind of weird fiction. I was the other thing that happened to me pretty young. I think I was about 14 or so when my father introduced me to Kafka,
Oh, for sure.
and
Metamorphosis. Yeah.
yeah, and he brought me the basic Kafka and sat down with me and kind of read a couple of stories and gave it to me, and that was it had a huge effect on me. So I think they were like these stories that were a kind of weird cross between science fiction of kind of the Ballard school, J.G. Ballard school, and then also kind of absurd Kafkaesque stories. So kind of those two things coming together.
Yeah, it's interesting. My father is a sci-fi fanatic, and growing up,
Mm.
since he was so into it, I almost felt a need to push away from it.
Yeah.
He was the dude you walk into the house and there's every single copy of every single paperback of Star Trek. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
that
Right.
heavy duty stuff.
Yeah.
And for me, I was more about like smoking weed and playing guitar and doing that
Right.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear that your mother actually wrote sci-fi and
Yeah. Yeah.
you know
And
and,
to be honest, she only published like 2 stories, so she
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
do a lot, and they were The when she was first doing it, she was writing for a Mormon science fiction anthology,
Oh,
and
wow.
which is just a weird combination. And her other story is also kind of like science fiction for Mormons. And so she was in a very specific kind of subcategory of
Yeah, for
science
sure.
fiction.
For
So, and
sure.
with me with science fiction, for years I read it growing up, and then I stopped. I think when I went to college, I just kind of stopped reading it entirely. And it wasn't until like my 30s that I found it again and went back to it. And I've
Mhm.
been, really, really love kind of revisiting a lot of stuff I read when I was
So,
younger.
so when you kind of started, I'm assuming you get to college, you're doing your thing. Are you writing short stories in college? Are you studying literature? What's your world like, as an early man,
Um,
younger man?
yeah. So when I was a freshman in college, I took creative writing classes. This is at Brigham Young University, and I took a couple of creative writing classes and went through the sequence and kind of got to the point where I was done with what they could offer. And it turned out there was a summer class that was being offered that was a graduate level creative writing class. And I was clueless. I went to the professor and I said, I'd like to take your class. And he let me in, even though I was a freshman. It was this Welsh poet named Leslie Norris, and he kind of went on to become a kind of huge mentor for me. And yeah, so yeah, I feel like I was dumb enough not to know I wasn't allowed to take a graduate level class when I was a freshman.
Well, I mean, I was dumb enough to not realize I could start this podcast. You know what I mean? Like, it's the kind of thing you kind of just go with it, and you don't
Yeah,
really know what's going to happen until you kind of jump in head first.
for
Obviously,
sure.
that's pretty intense for doing it that way. But you were writing the short stories, or were you thinking longer form fiction in the beginning?
Um, Short stories. I mean, I really started with short stories, and the first few short stories I published were published in like magazines on campus. There was a science fiction magazine which is called The Leading Edge that published one of my stories, maybe two. And then the newspaper published like a Halloween story I did,
Uh,
and that was kind of the start of it for me. And I think I've always been kind of more drawn to short stories than I have to novels.
Mhm. It's interesting, and this kind of comes up, I feel like, on every podcast now. There's
Mm,
the short story and there's the long form fiction. And, some authors start in that short realm and then kind of go and some do the other way. I
yeah.
started longer form and have been more newer to the short story form. And I find it much more difficult.
Yeah.
Less is more kind of thing,
Mm.
but you have to know what more is.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's about sensibility in some ways. I was talking to MT Anderson, young adult writer, about this, and he says, um, I write novels because if I have an idea, I want to go into like every detail of that idea and
Yeah.
explore it and work it out. He's like, you write stories, and it's like you're taking a good idea and just throwing it away.
I agree. I kind of agree with that,
Yeah,
though. You know,
yeah,
it's some authors have written novels that have started as a short story.
yeah.
Have you ever? I mean, are you ever those ideas ever boiling in your head? I mean, I look at you and it seems like you're a prolific writer, and we'll kind of get into the whole process of that.
Uh-huh.
But I mean, are these ideas just if an idea pops into your head, or is it automatically this is going to be a short story? This will be this. This will be that, or is it
Um,
until you get down to it until you realize what it is?
No, I pretty much know at this point, just because I feel like I've been doing it long enough. And it may be that I've just convinced myself that it's going to be a short story or a novel before I start working on it. And I do both at this point, but I'm way more naturally drawn to novellas and short stories than I am to novels. So every once in a while, I'll come across an idea that just needs a kind of longer treatment, needs a kind of longer development, and so it just demands that form.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say after writing, maybe a page or two, I have a pretty good idea of what the length of what I'm writing is going to be. Not exactly, it can change a little bit, but anytime I start writing something, I know pretty quickly if it's going to be a short story or a novel.
Uh-huh. So can you go back to that time when you're writing that first book, that first novel? I mean,
Uh-huh.
how old were you? What was going on in your life? Were you working? Were you teaching? Were you traveling? Were
Well,
you hanging out?
well, so I wrote a lot of I wrote several books when I was kind of an undergrad and early into my grad career as well, and never published those. I mean, I
Hmm.
just they weren't good, and a lot of those were longer books. They were novels. And then my first book of that came out was a book of stories called Altman's Tongue, and that was something I worked on in grad school. And so I'm kind of unusual in that. So right now I'm an excommunicated Mormon,
Uh-huh.
and very happily excommunicated. Um, but
One of my best friends is as well.
uh-huh,
He grew up
yeah,
in the Mormon church, and I have to be
I
honest, Jesse. I'm giving a shout out to Jesse. He lives in Chicago. Genuinely one of the nicest people I've ever met in my entire life. I mean,
yeah, I think both Mormons and ex-Mormons are for the most
yeah,
part.
I mean, he's
Mhm.
just so nice.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking to a guy who's where they filmed The Sopranos. That's where I grew up. So to me,
Right, right,
everyone's nice. Um,
right, right.
I'm supposed to go back to that. So
Oh,
yeah,
where was I? So
the co-
so I was yeah, so I was Mormon at the time. I was in grad school at University of Washington. I was doing a degree in I was doing a joint PhD in critical theory and English literature, and was married, had one young child, and just
busy
was
man.
working. Yeah, I was busy working on these stories. And in fact, where I would go to work on the stories, at the time I was still Mormon, and I was one of three people in charge of a congregation of Mormons. And the church had an office space that I could go in and use the printer and have just privacy because we had
Nice.
just a teeny apartment. And so I would go and work there, and wrote most of the book just there. And then, it didn't come out till I was teaching. First job was at Brigham Young University, and that's when my book came out.
Were you actively trying to get it published at that time when you finished it? I mean, was that the goal in the end?
Yeah. I mean, I had a sense. I started very quickly, kind of publishing in magazines. There was one magazine in particular called the Quarterly, which was run by this guy Gordon Lish, kind of controversial editor, and he published a fair amount of my stories. And then I was at AWP, Associated Writers program, in New York one year. This was like in '92 or '93, I guess, or maybe it was the MLA. It doesn't matter. And I met with Lish for the first time, spent some time with him, and just when I was leaving, he said, "Oh, and by the way, we're going to publish your book at Knopf." And so it kind of just came like that, which, I talked to a lot of people about their experiences publishing, and a lot of it is either hustle or luck or some combination of those two things. It's just somewhat random the way in which these things work out.
So were you dealing with any kind of rejection at that point though, or was it kind of just easy going? I mean, I've talked to, Janet Fitch said she paper mache'd her entire wall with rejections. I
Yeah.
got famously 73 of them. Like, what was the deal with you? I mean,
Yeah, same thing. I mean, I think there were a lot of when I was working on my stories as an undergrad, I like sent stuff out again and again, and nothing stuck. And so yeah, I think there's a story that probably went out 40 or 50 times.
uh-huh.
And in retrospect, maybe that's okay. Those didn't get published. But yeah, I mean, it definitely took some time, and it was a lot of effort. And that's one of the things that's tricky. I think from the outside, it probably looks easier than it is.
Hmm.
So yeah.
So coming from, being so involved in, the academic world at that point, was it influencing the way you actually wrote, as in the time of day you wrote, how you
Mhm.
I mean, were the people I mean, I'm assuming you were around workshopping things, working with people around other writers. Were you developing your style that early on, or do you think it still took some more time to really kind of click to what it was?
I think by the time I was in grad school, my style was pretty developed.
Hmm.
And it was um, I would write a lot from like 12 to 2 in the morning, because that
Yeah.
was
Okay.
like, yeah, time that I was guaranteed that I could have to myself.
Yeah, for sure.
And that my young child would be asleep probably, at least with a little luck. And so yeah, it was that I would write that way. I usually would write by hand on scratch paper, and then I would just type it into a computer and then revise it by hand.
It's before MacBook Airs, right?
It was definitely before MacBook Airs. And yeah, in fact, I like dot matrix printer of some of these stories, things like that.
And were you
Um,
sharing I'm sorry, were you sharing this early stuff with friends? Were you workshopping it? Were you bouncing ideas off of people?
so as an undergrad, I mean, I was in workshops, but when I went to grad school, I didn't actually, I took one workshop, and then otherwise I just took kind of, English courses and critical theory courses.
Hmm.
And the one workshop I took, I won't say who was the leader of the workshop, but it was not very good. And I thought, this is, the advice that's being given here is not productive for me anyway. And so I decided not to do much with it. But then I
Hmm.
also was like, there were people who were publishing in magazines that I was publishing in that I was starting to get to know and starting to have a sense of. There was a little magazine called Magic Realism that was publishing some stuff of mine, and I got to know like Jeff Vandermeer. He was there at the time. He had
You said Jeff Vandermeer?
Yeah.
I think he's coming on the podcast. I think in like a couple, and should be coming hopefully in January.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good to know. I'll name drop you.
Right. Yeah, and we both had a book that was supposed to come out with Pix Press.
Okay.
And then it just collapsed, and Jeff realized it was going to collapse well before I did. But yeah. So and I got to know people at the Quarterly, and slowly kind of had a group of people whose work I admired. Very few. I've never really shared my work that much with people besides just sending it to editors. I kind of I don't know why. I guess I didn't, except for the workshops and undergraduate, I didn't really grow up kind of doing that. So.
I mean, is it the kind of thing where when you're doing, are you a heavy draft guy, a lot of revisions? Do you trust your gut? So when you're going back on something, say you wrote 6 months ago, like I'm the kind of guy, if I wrote something 6 months ago, I read it back, it makes me laugh again. It stays in. Like, do you have little rules like that you kind of set for yourself to kind of make the process a little easier?
Well, I definitely revise a lot, and I go through a lot of drafts, and for me, it's a very kind of like tactile thing. So the fact that I write everything by hand, and my handwriting is so messy, it's like sometimes it's hard if I don't put it in the computer pretty quickly, I can't read it.
Yeah.
But I'll write by hand until I get to the point where I'm stuck, and then I'll type it in, and then I'll print that out, revise it, and then keep on writing by hand from it. And so by the time I finish a piece, sometimes the beginning's been revised, a half dozen or a dozen times, usually more like a dozen. And so just over time, I mean, and I think it's probably instinct or impulse as much as anything else, just figuring out what sounds good and making choices. Yeah, I mean, it feels very intuitive to me as a process.
Well, again, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, the list is prolific. How do you have it? I mean, when you start a project, you know how long it's going to take you to write a novel at this point. Do you know how long it's going to take you to write an essay, things like that? Are you able to streamline the process a little more being this far down the line?
You would hope that would be the case, but I find that every project's just its own project. And there are things.
Do you work on multiple projects at a time or just one at a time?
I do. No, I always work on multiple projects.
Yeah, you have to.
Yeah, no, and if I get stuck in one, I'm always working on at least a story and a novel length project at the same time, and sometimes several stories. And if I get stuck on one, then I switch to another sometimes. So and that works for me. I mean, I know not everybody can do that, but yeah, it's like it's so variable. It's like, sometimes I think the fastest novel I wrote was when I wrote as B.K. Evenson, my Aliens novel, which is more of a kind of genre novel. I'm playing around with somebody else's world. And that I wrote the first draft of in something like 22 days. And it was just like super intense. Slowest novel I wrote was The Open Curtain, and that took me about 6 years.
Do you think, in just a quick thought, do you think you're able to write that in The Other Lies, write that so quickly because you were trying to be someone else? I mean, was the ego kind of gone? Was it easier to just put yourself in someone else's shoes? The song "The Stranger" by Billy Joel just popped into my head for some reason.
I think it's yeah. I mean, it's a different project. I mean, what they would do anytime I've done those sorts of novels, they've had me do them by I have to write an outline first. It's like a 10-page outline, 20-page outline. So it's like by the time I've done that, I have a really good idea of how the story's going to go. So I did a couple of Dead Space novels based on a video game, and I did the Aliens novel, a couple other things. And yeah, those go faster, and I think it's partly because it's just more. It feels like playing around. So, and I think you're right. It probably is. My ego is not getting in the way, or I'm not as I still think they're good, but I also think it's like a different sort of process for me, and it's partly that there's already been so much work done with world creation for something like Aliens. You have a real sense of how the world works and what the aliens are like and so on and so forth, that you can just kind of run with it.
I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if you're a Stephen King fan. admittedly, I'm not the biggest Stephen King fan. I'd love to talk. He's Stephen King, right? How can you not? But I
Mhm.
did love, and if correct me if I'm wrong, the Bachman books.
Uh-huh.
That's my favorite Stephen King stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
one of them
Those
became
are
what
fun.
was it the Running Man or was it Total Recall?
I think it's The Running Man, is my memory. Yeah.
And my again, we were talking earlier. My father was a huge sci-fi guy, and that was one of the movies he sat me down as a younger man, as a kid, really,
Hmm.
and made me watch those old school Arnold Schwarzenegger. I remember seeing the third boob in Total Recall and just totally, just what the fuck is this? You know what I mean? I
Right,
must have been
right,
7 years old.
right.
Yeah, it's interesting though. I mean, I wonder. I wonder if musicians would wish they could do that too. I'm
Hmm.
you can see the guitar behind me. I've been
Right.
playing music my whole life, and if no one's really kind of coming to my mind, but if they can be that alter ego and they can just write a whole nother genre of
Yeah,
music and just
yeah,
be able
yeah,
to kind of separate the two.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
would you do that all the time if you could? Would you live in that alternate universe?
No, I like that. It's fun to visit, but I'm actually, I'm more committed to the universe that is the Brian Evanson universe as opposed to the BK Evanson universe.
Uh huh. Uh huh.
So I mean, it's those are super fun to write. It's always fun to play around with someone else's world and their form, and yeah, but yeah, I feel
Yeah.
like the work I'll probably be remembered for, if I'm remembered at all, is the stuff I do under Brian Evanson.
Well, and one of the reasons I'm super stoked to talk to you is a lot of the authors I talk to have 2 novels out, 3 novels out. It took
Hmm.
them 4 years and got in, not win awards and all these kinds of things. With you again, it seems like it's just you have this snow, and I like it. To me, it seems like it's just you have discipline, you have a work ethic. You can't
Yeah.
create that much work without. I mean, were you always early on? Were you a disciplined kind of guy when it came to your writing?
Yeah.
Can you talk
Uh,
about that?
yeah, I mean, I had to be, when I was younger, just because I had so little time. I was going to grad school. I was super busy. My wife at the time was going to grad school as well. We had a young child, and so it was like the thing I found is if I had like I might only have like 15 or 20 minutes
It's my life
in a
now.
stretch. Yeah, and and when you do, I mean, that's it. You take advantage of it if you can, and you learn how to take advantage of that time.
Exactly.
And so I think a lot of people I know, a lot of students, now it's like they get online, they watch a bunch of cat videos. It's like a lot of revving up and kind of getting to the point where you can write. And I just don't do that as much. I mean, when
Hmm.
I'm writing.
Yeah, and for me, again, it's so hard to resist every single thing
Oh,
around
for
us.
sure. Yeah.
Again, you started in early, you said early '90s. How has that changed throughout the process of your writing? The introduction of technology. Do you write differently because of technology? Are you aware of people's attention spans in the year of almost 2021? I mean, how
Yeah.
do you not give a shit? Do you just do you?
I think because I've always liked writing stories more than novels, I think the attention span thing is not as much of an issue as it might be for someone who wants to write a big kind of gigantic novel.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I think there's definitely been huge changes in the way people think, and also positive changes in terms of like things like television and the way that television is rethought how it should work in terms of these kind of long form narrative TV shows that are doing really exciting
Have
things.
you ever worked in television before?
I've done stuff around the edges, but I haven't, not yet.
Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, no, I haven't talked to any television writers yet. It's a dream of mine to get some of the writers from The Sopranos on the podcast because
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, I'd imagine that's just a totally, I mean, that's completely different than fiction,
yeah,
long form fiction.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
No, I
no,
have a
that
lot of friends who write in television rooms in Hollywood, and yeah, and I think it's somewhat different, but it's also really collaborative. And I think if you've done like a creative writing workshop, there's at least some connections to it, except that you're all working on a piece together in a way.
and that's the thing. It's collaborative. It's the complete
Yeah,
opposite of writing sitting in a room
right,
in a little room with no windows and trying to
right,
finish,
right,
a friggin' novel.
right.
It's crazy. So that leads us up really kind of up today. I mean, you won a bunch of awards. You've kind of done it all. What's the motivation? What do you what gets you going now?
Yeah.
Are you still reading? What do you do?
I read a lot. I really love to read, and I come from a family that both my parents, when we'd go on vacation, they would just like we drive to like a beach house and they'd pull up and then get out their books and sit on the couch and read. And so that's something genetically I seem to have inherited. So I read a lot. I still am finding work every once in a while that's really exciting to me. It's not always the work. It's rarely the work that gets recommended in kind of big newspapers and periodicals. But there's still great stuff out there. And yeah, I mean, I have. There's something about writing that I find just really satisfying personally. There's something about it, especially when it's going good, that like it does something in my mind.
Mhm.
It kind of sparks something that I really like. So it's almost addictive, I suppose, at this point.
You still
Um,
deal with bad days?
yeah, there's always bad days. I used to write every day. I don't write every day at this point. I mean, I kind of make choices. I do something kind of related to writing every day,
Uh-huh.
but it's like, I don't necessarily write every day.
Uh-huh.
Um, and yeah, I mean, there are moments when it's not coming, and I think what's happened is over time I've realized that it will come eventually.
Yeah.
And so I just know that that's part of the process, and it doesn't make me panic like it might have when I was younger.
Hmm. I mean,
So,
I live in San Francisco, and I moved apartments now. I've been trying to finish a novel for 3 years. I've been writing it,
mhm,
and I'm on the downhill, running the downhill. It's there.
yeah,
But now I have a little puppy. I have a small business that I've been trying to keep together during this crazy time.
yeah,
Um, you know, I have, like you were saying, you have 15 minutes. I'm fucking writing on washing machines. I'm
yeah,
writing when I'm doing the dishes. I'm writing, and one of the good things about technology is I write on my phone a lot.
yeah,
So when a novella started on my phone, I
yeah,
wrote an
yeah.
entire. Do you do that? Are you, if you say you don't write every day, but you are writing every day? Is that part of it?
Yeah, I mean, well, I do some of that. I mean, I what I do is I put notes on my phone. I was just going to see if there's anything that would make any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I
Hmm.
do kind of put
Exactly.
things, and they always kind of evolve, but I find myself constantly notating things, and often if I'm working on something, I'll go back to that list and kind of play around
Are
with
you
what's there.
are you a voice memo guy?
I haven't done voice memos so much. I mean, I do is I speak it into my the notes function rather than voice memo. Do you do voice memo stuff or?
I do. I mean, sometimes, again, I own the business I own is a dog walking business, so I'm
Hmm.
alone in the woods with dogs all day.
Right,
So if something it comes into my head, it's whatever's the quickest way I can do it.
right, right,
I don't recite full dialogue, but
right.
I'll be like, I'm working on a rock and roll book. If like a little
Yeah,
key turn, I can just, you know, he said this instead of that. Delete that
right, right.
here.
Yeah, yeah,
Again, there's so many things going on in most people's lives.
yeah.
It sounded like you weren't the kind of author who had the opportunity to sit in the woods for
Mm.
3 years and by a lake and
Right.
contemplate. But there are some authors who are able to do that. And you said it's a
Yeah.
hustle, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, it's funny because I've talked to people. So I when I write by hand, I only use like scratch paper, so really crappy paper, and I use hotel pens that I get free in hotels, and it's partly that it makes it feel like it's not like a serious process or something. It doesn't make it feel like, oh, I'm writing literature. Um, and I think that that's really actually been very helpful to me, just to kind of feel like I can convince myself that I'm doing something that's just whatever.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of friends who I for years I dated someone who was a writer, and she had like this incredibly fancy fountain pen, and she would use this kind of cream colored paper, really good stock, and she wrote some great things, but it was very hard sometimes for her to write.
Yeah.
And I think it was the thing I always thought is it's like it's the way you've kind of set this up. Or the same thing with, like, I know a lot of writers who have like a space that they have to be in to write, a very specific space. And yeah, and I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, early on I felt that. Early on I also felt like I could only write a song on one specific guitar, and then you
yeah,
realize, well, that's not going to be the case if you ever want to get anything done.
right, right.
Yeah, I
Right,
mean,
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's insane. That's insane. So that
yeah.
leads us to today. So what are you working on? I mean, nowadays, are you kind of, what's going on with you now?
Well, so I have a new book I finished, which is called The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell,
You have a
which is a
copy of
book
it
of
by
stories.
chance?
I don't, because it's not out till
Well,
August.
oh,
So
okay, good to know. We'll,
yeah,
we'll
yeah.
we'll pump it for sure.
Right. And then so that'll come out in August. And then, the latest book, Song for the Unraveling of the World, won a bunch of awards, won the World Fantasy Award and the Shirley Jackson Award.
Is that a
Was a
fun
fun,
process for you?
it's with the Shirley Jackson Award. I think this is maybe the sixth time I've been nominated for it for
Uh,
some reason. And I was so used to just losing every time that it was really stunning that I actually won it. It's like they asked, because of the pandemic this year, they did it all online, and they asked
uh-huh.
everyone to record a speech in advance, and I did that, and the whole time I was doing it, I just thought, yeah, this is ridiculous. This is a waste of my time. Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
And then I won. So it's like, so somehow the less prepared I am to win, so that seems to be when I do win. And then the World Fantasy was great too. I was really stunned to win that and happy about it as well.
Yeah. I mean, Brian, this has been an absolute pleasure. I always ask at the end of this, where are people buying your books from? I mean, I know you're a SoCal guy, but you kind of been all over the place. Can you
Yeah,
pump
yeah.
some other places?
Yeah. I mean, I can pump. Powell's is always amazing up
And up in Portland?
in Portland.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I've read at Green Apple a bunch.
Oh, really? Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
Mhm.
One of the first guest or the second guest we ever had on was Kevin, the owner of Green Apple.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
They're dear to me because I self-published my first book
Mhm.
3 weeks before the world shut down.
Right.
And they were the one bookstore that just was behind me from day one. I mean, they put that fucking thing right in the front. It was a
That's great.
boxing novella. Yeah, no, to this day. So that's great to hear that you were that. Yeah, that's you have a link to them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, anytime I'm in San Francisco, I go to Green Apple,
Yeah.
and I mean, there's a lot of used bookstores I go to up there as well. Where else? Yeah, I mean, there's tons of places. Skylight in Los Angeles is great.
Okay, for sure.
Yeah, yeah,
I've,
yeah.
I've, I've been there for sure. Are you a Twitter, Instagram? Do you do any Facebook kind of stuff?
I do Facebook, but I don't do Twitter or Instagram. I've kind of
Smart.
resisted. Well, I don't know if it's smart or not, but yeah.
I mean, I don't know. Twitter's. You know what? You probably would do well in the world of Twitter. I think people would dig you there for some reason.
Uh-huh.
I don't
Maybe.
know.
I don't know.
I
I
don't
mean,
know.
I keep on, my agent keeps saying things to me like, oh, you really should be on Twitter. Why don't you give that a try? And I haven't been able to bring myself to do it.
You got shit to
Yeah. Yeah.
do. Brian, absolute pleasure, man. Thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks. You too.
Bye.
Bye.